Welcome, everybody. I can invite you all to take a seat. We are delighted you are all here. I'm Matthew Bowman. I'm the Howard Hooker Chair of Mormon Studies here at Claremont Graduate University. And I am thrilled to have you here. This conference, I think, has been in the works since the beginnings of this program 18 years ago. In 2009, Claudia Bushman founded the Mormon Women's Oral History Project here, and you will hear a lot of discussion of that project here today. And I think that project signaled a few things about this program. Certainly, it's interesting questions of gender and agency, but also in lived reality, what it is like to live one's daily life as a religious person, with how that manifests in the lives of people who academics have not always studied. More recently, we have had in the program an increasing interest in art and a turn to art, and you will see certainly, I think, some of that over the course of today as well. So we see here, I think, in everything that's going to be happening here today, both where this program has been and where it is going. I'm glad to have you all along for the ride. I want to mention just a few mechanics of how this is going to go. You will see in the hallways behind you, if you did not pick it up already, a swag bag and name tags. You will also see back there a couple of other things. First, of course, the art show, Becoming Sovereign, which was in many ways, I think, the genesis of this entire conference. I invite you to go back there and look at it over lunchtime and during the breaks. You will also see an oral history table there as well. You're invited to visit that during the breaks and at lunchtime to learn more about our oral history projects and perhaps participate in a little micro oral history yourself. And while you are enjoying all of those things, you will see the bathrooms back there too. This program is being recorded. It will be available on our program's website, probably as soon as next week. So with that, again, I want to welcome all of you, and I am now going to invite the person who this program owes more than anyone else to, Dr. Kline, Research Assistant Professor of Religion here at Claremont Graduate University.
Thank you, everyone. I am so excited to be here today. I'm just going to pull up my presentation really quickly. So before we begin our panels, I want to briefly frame why we chose to organize this concept around this conference around the concept of agency. In Mormon thought, agency is the foundational ability to choose between right and wrong. In the academy, however, the term has taken on broader meanings and become one of the central frameworks scholars use to study women and religious traditions, particularly traditions like Mormonism that maintain gendered roles and patriarchal structures. But agency is also a contested concept among scholars. For the next few minutes, I'm going to briefly trace a few of the debates that have shaped it. Let me begin with a question that has animated the study of Mormon women, and really women in many religious traditions. And that is this: how do women navigate, inhabit, and reshape the religious worlds they live in? Questions like these explain why agency has become such a generative framework in the study of women in religion. Now, at its most basic level, agency refers to the capacity to act, the ability to make choices, shape one's life, and affect the world around us. But scholars have long debated what counts as agency and where we locate it. In some of the earliest feminist scholarship on religion, and this is scholarship that was enormously important in exposing gender inequalities in church teachings, organizations, and systems, we saw traditional religious women often being interpreted by these scholars as victims of oppression. And while this work again was crucial in exposing systemic inequities, other scholars felt it could not quite fully account for the complexity of religious women's lives. So thinkers like Janice Bodie and Lila Abu-Lughod turned to agency to better understand how women exercised power within constraining religious worlds. They pointed to women who resisted teachings or cultural expectations that limited them, women who advocated for themselves, women who challenged institutional norms. Scholars also explored additional forms of agency within religious life. They examined women who reinterpreted religious teachings in ways that fostered spiritual authority, meaning, and dignity. These scholars showed how participation in religion could itself become a source of skill, leadership, social connection, and influence. Now, agency complicated earlier portrayals of women in traditional religions as primarily passive recipients of patriarchy. So it introduced complexity, it restored emotion and intention to women's lives. But eventually, scholars noticed that many of these models still assumed agency involved women moving towards autonomy, towards equality, and involved resistance to restrictive norms. And this is where the anthropologist Saba Mahmood fundamentally reshaped the conversation. In her landmark work, Politics of Piety, Mahmood studied women in the Egyptian mosque movement who actively cultivated religious devotion, modesty, and piety. And these women were not resisting religious tradition, they were actively embracing it. Mahmood argued that scholars had too often interpreted agency through specifically Western liberal values, values like liberation, self-assertion, and freedom from authority. But what if the women themselves understood human flourishing differently? What if their goal was not autonomy, but piety? Not independence, but moral formation? Not liberation from religious structures, but meaningful participation within them? Mahmood argued that agency can certainly encompass resistance, but that it can also be found in the deliberate choice to inhabit religious disciplines and commitments. Compliance itself, she wrote, can be agentive when it reflects conscious ethical striving. Her work transformed the study of women in religion because it asked scholars to take religious women's own moral worlds seriously. Now, Mormon studies scholars then have added further nuance to these conversations. Amy Hoyt, for instance, explores what we might call simultaneous agency, the way resistance and compliance can coexist in the same act. For example, she describes a Mormon woman in the 1980s responding to President Benson's call for mothers to come home from the workplace by actually reducing her hours rather than leaving the workforce entirely. So there you have compliance and resistance existing together in the same moment. In my own work with mostly devout global Mormon women, I found that women's agentive actions were often oriented less toward autonomy than toward what I call non-oppressive connectedness, the pursuit of ethical, sustaining relationships with family, community, and God. Women made major decisions like joining the church, leaving marriages, pursuing education, building careers, not primarily to maximize independence, but to cultivate sustaining relationships and resist abuse, alienation, and domination. Catherine Breckus has also offered important insights for understanding historical Mormon women's agency. Building on Mahmood's work, she reminds us that agency can involve compliance as well as resistance, and that agency exists on a continuum. No one possesses complete freedom to shape the world, and no one lacks agency entirely. But, she says, agency is unevenly distributed through structures of gender, race, class, education, and religious authority. Breckus writes that Mormon women exercise agency in important ways, while also lacking access to many forms of institutional power available to men. And this points to a larger insight running through many of these approaches, and that is this: agency cannot be separated from structure. Human beings shape institutions, yes, but institutions also shape human imagination, desire, and possibility. And that is part of what makes agency such a useful framework for studying Mormon women. It pushes us beyond questions like, were women oppressed or were they empowered? Instead, it asks, how are women shaped by and how do they reshape religious worlds? How do women imagine flourishing, devotion, and belonging? What forms of action were available to women and why? What kinds of lives and worlds were women trying to create? These questions make space for complexity, for contradiction, faith, culture, embodiment, constraint, and creativity. And that is precisely what this conference today hopes to do. Today, we're going to hear scholars explore women's lives as they examine history, creative practice, and lived experience. These conversations can deepen our understanding not only of Mormon women, but of agency itself and how it is negotiated and reimagined. And so with that, welcome. I am excited to learn with all of you today. And this is where we get to launch into our very first panel. So we are lucky enough to have Vinna joining us through Zoom. So let me just get her situated. Hey, Vinna, feel free to turn on your camera. We will be handing it over to you in just a minute.
Yeah. Are you gonna put the Google slide or do I need to share it?
Vinna, I would love for you to share your screen. So let me give you hosting ability.
Let me just,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, well, she gets that ready. I just wanted to introduce this panel a tiny bit. So this panel that we're launching into right now asks us to think about oral history not simply as a method of collecting information, but as a space where agency is exercised through narration itself. Now, when Mormon women tell their stories of their lives, their faiths, doubts, relationships, and transformations, they're not just preserving history, they are interpreting experience and shaping how their lives are remembered. These presentations that we're about to hear explore the richness of Mormon women's oral histories and invite us to consider listening as both a scholarly and an ethical practice. So we are very lucky today also to have, I'm going to introduce all the people involved in this panel. First off, let me introduce Kelsey Walker. Raise your hand, Kelsey. She is a professional genealogist and is currently working toward her PhD in history at Claremont Graduate University. She works at the AIM section of immigration research and family history, and she has been my research assistant for the couple of years now, and has been instrumental in helping with our Mormon oral history collections. She went on maternity leave this last semester, and I went into mourning because I was lost without her. And I am so glad that she's able to come here today to moderate. We have as our first speaker, Vinna Chowriamah, who is a PhD candidate in religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on global Christianities in the South Asian diaspora. Her earlier work on global Mormonism examined how Latter-day Saint faith intersects with Indian cultural identity in Mauritius. Her current dissertation investigates devotion to the Lady of Balankani in Mauritius and how this Indian Marian devotion has become a space where Indo-Mauritian and Creole Catholic women negotiate and reshape religious, ethnic, and cultural boundaries. I have seen Vinna present her work a few times before, and I am feeling so lucky that she's here with us today. We also have Erika. Feinhauer, whose paper I just lost, Erica. Let me just introduce her really quickly from memory. Erika just achieved professor, full professor at BYU, and you are in teacher education program at BYU.
This is a test.
I know. She's doing so well. Right. And she is now, you study belonging, you study identity, you study bicultural. Oh my gosh, am I getting it?
You're getting it.
Okay, well, help me out at any moment. And also you're about to launch into a really exciting project in Fiji where you will be doing oral histories with women there. So you're going to be getting involved with our oral history program, which I'm so excited about. So
Yeah.
Erika, thank you so much for being here today. And Nancy Ross over here is one of my very good friends, someone I admire deeply. She is a professor at Utah Tech University in the interdisciplinary studies department. She originally actually got her PhD in art history, but has now transitioned to this other department and does some really fascinating sociological work nowadays. She has been department chair, I know, and has just been involved in so many things. She studies LDS women and Community of Christ women. So with that, I'm going to step back, and Vinna, I am going to let you take over.
All right. Thank you, Caroline. My camera is not working, so you'll only be seeing the slides, the Google slides. But thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
We can.
Perfect. So, well, Vanakkam. This is the South Indian Tamil salutation for good morning, but thank you for being here. And for this presentation, I will discuss two case studies that illustrate the many definitions of agency that Caroline have been talking about just before among Latter-day Saint women in Mauritius, and also some of my reflections regarding the insider-outsider dynamics when conducting oral history. But before I do that, I would like to give you a brief introduction on Mauritius. Mauritius is a small island that is located off the east coast of Madagascar. To put its size into perspective, it is kind of like similar size than the state of Delaware. It used to be a French colony and then a British colony before gaining its independence in 1968. It has no indigenous population. Mauritians are all immigrants coming from somewhere else. Today, the population of Mauritius is 1.2 million, so it's a busy island. Indians form the dominant ethnic group, followed by those of African descent, which we call back home Creole, people of Creole descent. Franco-Mauritians, so a mix of French and of Mauritian and Chinese Mauritian. Religiously, Mauritius Hinduism dominates on the island, followed by Christianity, mainly Catholicism, Islam, and Buddhism. Although Mauritian society celebrates multiculturalism, it is also masks the complicated power structures between ethnicities. For example, in many cities and towns on the island, it is common to see a Catholic church, a mandir, which is a North Indian name for a Hindu temple, a kovil, that's a South Indian temple, and a mosque in the same neighborhood. Yet many Mauritians remain racially, culturally, and ethnically segregated while still embracing their Mauritian identity. And so this is a picture of my hometown, and it is just 2 minutes from my house. So you'll see the Catholic church that I grew up going, and there is the mandir, the North Indian Mauritians to attend. And this is a longer view where you see another Indian temple, and this is a South Indian. So you see this commonly everywhere around the island on many different towns and cities. And it is within this complicated society that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint emerged in the early 1980s. And you're seeing a picture of the early members when they started the church in the 80s on the island. So as I said, for this presentation, I will talk about two case studies, two women who identify as Creole, Mauritian, and also Latter-day Saint. In 2019, I traveled to Mauritius for 3 weeks where I conducted oral history interviews among Latter-day Saints living on the island. During my trip, I interviewed Elizabeth, and this is a pseudonym, an older Creole Mauritian woman. She is a convert. She and her husband had been part of the church for more than 20 years. They have both served in many leadership roles in the church. One of the questions that I asked during the interview was about the creation of the Global Hymn Book. I asked her about what she thought about the possibility of creating a Latter-day Saint hymn book in Mauritian Creole, which is our vernacular language, since it is our mother tongue. She immediately responded that she loved having church services and hymn books in French and felt that the hymns should remain in that language rather than Mauritian Creole. She commented that she viewed the French language as a pure language, therefore more appropriate, more respectful for worshiping. I was surprised by her reaction because I knew she spoke Creole frequently at home. And the irony was that we were actually conducting the interview in Mauritian Creole. After she rejected the idea of creating a hymn book in Creole, I related to her that in Utah there is an African Swahili branch of the church that sings church hymns in Swahili and other African languages. I told her that I had visited this branch on a Sunday with my children and had observed the congregation enjoying singing the hymns in Swahili. I also showed her a YouTube video of the B1 celebration, which celebrated the 40th anniversary of the 1978 revelation on the priesthood, where a multicultural choir sang gospel music. After I shared my experiences about the Swahili branch and the B1 video, she got very excited and changed her mind about the language that would be appropriate for the hymn book in Mauritius. She went on to say that she thought it would be a wonderful idea to have the hymn book in Mauritian Creole. This change of reaction right away made me pause and reflect on its implications, especially when thinking about the role of women among Latter-day Saint, among Latter-day, a role of agency among Latter-day Saint women. Why did Elizabeth suddenly change her position? Had she always felt this way but was hesitant to speak up? I have thought a lot about this interaction with her since I've interviewed her. One could easily argue that my position as a church member helped Elizabeth feel more comfortable and trust me. She also knew that at that time of our interview, I was doing my master's at Utah State University and working as an intern for the church history department in Salt Lake City. But was it only my church membership that made her feel comfortable enough to share her perspective and even change it openly? I do think there's more to that story. You see, I grew up in Mauritius and left the island at the age of 21. I have been on the island. I have been living in the United States since then. In contrast, Elizabeth continues to live on the island with her family, including her grandchildren. From a racial perspective in Mauritius, Elizabeth, along with other Creoles of African descent, has experienced marginalization within a social order shaped by the dominant Hindu power structures. Although I am not a Hindu and was raised as a fifth-generation South Indian Catholic on the island, I also acknowledge that I grew up in a middle-class family that benefited from certain social advantages linked to my South Indian identity. Because of this, I understand that I may still be perceived by Mauritian Creoles, such as Elizabeth, as part of a dominant social group, even though I have also been marginalized due to my Catholic identity. Elizabeth has known me since I was a teenager. Even though I was not a member of the Latter-day Saint Church at that time, I continued spending time with the church members and the missionaries on the island. Sorry, I'm trying to find that picture. Despite the complexities of our racial, ethnic, and religious identities, Elizabeth and I were able to exercise our agency in a more nuanced manner during the interview. This flexibility and reciprocity allowed a richer conversation to take place. When she spoke about wanting to keep the hymns in French because she viewed it as pure language, I listened carefully to her reasoning, while while also feeling comfortable enough to respectfully challenge her perspective. Showing her the YouTube video of the B1 celebration also surprised her. Although the event took place in June 2018, she had never heard about it before. In all her years as a member of the church in Mauritius, she had never witnessed a multicultural choir singing gospel music, let alone one led by an African American woman. In fact, she didn't even know who Gladys Knight was. For Elizabeth, the video represented something highly significant: a Black woman leading a choir composed of Latter-day Saints from diverse racial backgrounds, all performing a new genre of hymns in the conference center in Utah. This was definitely not the Tabernacle Choir, the only choir that Elizabeth was familiar with. This was also very different from the small choir she was used to seeing in Mauritius in her local branch, where Mauritian Latter-day Saints of all racial backgrounds sang during sacrament meeting at the local branch in French, not Creole. It was her first time seeing a public celebration of Latter-day Saint African culture on an international platform. The only church events that she had previously experienced on a global scale for the church were only general conference sessions. Talking about the Swahili branch from my first my own first-hand experience and showing her the YouTube video of the B1 celebration reassured her that she could open up and be vulnerable. These moments also encouraged her to reconsider some of her earlier assumptions, not only as a Latter-day Saints living in the global South, but also as a Creole woman who had grown up with the idea that speaking French meant you are better, that you're moving up. Mauritius is a multilingual island. Creole is the dominant unofficial vernacular spoken by the majority of Mauritians. Most Mauritians are also fluent in French, which remains the primary language used in newspapers and media. English, meanwhile, is used by government officials as written communication for legislations, and the Mauritian public school systems follow an English-based curriculum. Public schools in Mauritius also teaches ancestral languages such as Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, Urdu, and Mandarin. In addition, the government and various social cultural organizations actively promote the use and preservation of these ancestral languages within the ethnic communities. This linguistic diversity places many Mauritians in an advantageous position when pursuing educational opportunities and employment abroad. At the same time, Mauritius' multilingual environment also creates complex social and cultural interactions among ethnic groups. Anthropologist Patrick Elsoy, who has written extensively on the promotion and challenges of languages in Mauritius, argued, quote, cultivation of ancestral languages as components and mediators of ancestral cultures is part of a hegemonic notion of cultural citizenship, according to which Mauritians are primarily conceived as subjects with origins in other parts of the world and ongoing commitments to diasporic ancestral cultures. Accordingly, full membership in a Mauritian nation is formed by the cultivation of such ancestral cultures, while the Creoles, having recognized claim on an ancestral culture, inhabit a more marginalized position in the nation. While it is true that many ethnic communities on the island maintain strong ties to their ancestral languages for a range of reasons, including political, social, and economic advantages, I agree with Elsor that Mauritius' multilingual environment also carries a dual burden. French and English remain closely associated with colonial history and continue to function as markers of prestige in contemporary Mauritian society. Often,
Vinna, can you hear me?
yes,
This is excellent. Sorry, there's no other way for me to give you your 1 minute time
yeah,
accepted.
perfect.
So, let you know 1 minute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Where am I? Okay. In contrast, despite sustained by the government and educators to promote Mauritian Creole, it is still frequently devaluated. Um, I'm gonna move to something else. Since its establishment in Mauritius, church meetings were primarily conducted in French. However, an oral history interview I conducted with a younger Creole women revealed tensions surrounding the use of French in church setting. Deborah, who joined the church in Mauritius in the 90s, remained an active member today, though she now lives outside Mauritius, reflected on her early experiences during her first year in the church there. She said, quote, "The French thing was a weird thing at church. French scriptures, French hymns, everybody was pretending to be like the French people. It felt awkward. Very few members at church spoke Creole. There was only one woman who was a church leader of Creole descent, and she made me feel welcome and comfortable. Everyone speaks Creole in Mauritius. It is a spoken language. I think lessons should be in Creole and talks should be in Creole. When talks are given in French, it sounds too formal, too posh. It makes people back away. It intimidates people who are not fluent in speaking French or English. Then they think, oh, this is an upper middle class church. Mauritians don't mind having the scriptures in French, but if they have to speak and engage in French only, then it is a problem." Unquote. The irony of Latter-day Saints' experience in Mauritius is that some Creole members distance themselves from emancipatory aspirations within the church. By avoiding Mauritian Creole in worship, they may consciously or not align themselves with a more socially elevated status. In a context where Creoles are often marginalized, French is sometimes preferred over the Creole language in church as a way of signaling respectability and social mobility. As a result, it is important to examine how language intersects with race, power, and local leadership within Mauritian Latter-day Saint congregations. This case study also serves as an example of cosmopolitan societies in which language shape and is shaped by worship practices within the Latter-day Saint community. Do I have a few more seconds or am I done?
I think, Vinna, we're probably about done.
Yeah, I
Yep,
think
okay, perfect.
on track to do that. Thank you.
Thanks. I will give you a 1 minute. I love that so much.
I love it when someone else has to, gets to take time, keep me on track. So how do I find my,
Erika, you issue the microphone.
I don't know how. Have it on, me. Thank you. Wonderful. Nice to meet with you this morning. As Caroline said, I'm Dr. Erika Feinhauer. I'm professor, full professor of teacher education. And I usually study things, I really, really appreciated Vinna's talking about language and identity and agency. These are things that I study as well, typically in more like school settings. I'm currently going to Fiji for a sabbatical project, gave sabbaticals, to look at dual language bilingual education as a equitable educational system in Fiji to really overcome some of these issues related to language and identity. And as part of that, I'm also going to be conducting some oral histories. And so we were talking and thought this is a really great opportunity for me to also gather some oral histories and learn more about oral histories as a method. And so that's what I'm doing today, is talking about how we use oral histories to examine LDS female sovereignty. Now, what do I mean by sovereignty? About a year, maybe a year and a half ago, I got together, was coerced by my good friend MacArthur Krishna, which some of you know. When she says you're going to do something, you do it. So MacArthur, Amy Jensen, Susan Christiansen, and Barb Christiansen, we got together and came up with this definition of LDS female sovereignty, which was the basis for the art that was, the art show that was put on, how do you say this, art people, at Compass Gallery in Provo, and also portions of it are here as well. And this was the definition that was given to say, what does this look like? There's also Wayfair magazine. There's some Wayfair magazines here as well. They're beautiful essays to sort of commission thoughts and representations of what LDS female sovereignty looks like. And what I'm going to try to do today, in a very, very cursory sort of preliminary analysis, is show what LDS female sovereignty looks like in these oral histories. I think this is such a beautiful collection to really help us see what it looks like in the lived experiences of LDS women. So I am guided by standpoint theory, and perhaps some of you, I won't get too theoretical. I was warned. But standpoint theory is really a theoretical approach that it promotes the idea that people's knowledge and perspectives are shaped by their social positions and lived experiences, particularly within systems of power and inequality. The theory argues that marginalized groups can offer unique and valuable insights into social realities because they experience structures of power from positions that are often overlooked by dominant group members. So it's commonly used in feminist, critical, and social justice research to examine how identity, experience, and power influence what people know and how knowledge is produced. And I think that's key. So here are some of the key theorists of standpoint theory, used a lot in Black feminist thought as well. So I'll just not going to go over that, but that's the background. And I think it's really informative and useful when we think about LDS female sovereignty, because LDS women often navigate tensions between devotion, gender expectations, caregiving, leadership, and personal agency. And their standpoint can illustrate how doctrine, culture, and practice are actually experienced in everyday life, creating this knowledge, right? Researchers using standpoint theory might treat LDS women's experiences not as peripheral, but as valuable sources of knowledge about power, participation, identity, and spiritual community within Mormon contexts. And lo and behold, we have 300 oral histories, right, of LDS women and their experiences. Claudia Bushman famously said, if we want to live forever in the minds and annals of the earth, if we want other women to be represented in the future, we have to leave a record. So I've enjoyed diving into these oral histories as a preparation for my own oral history work in Fiji, and have been inspired and learned a lot from these women's stories. So I'm just most of you know, I believe in this audience about the oral histories, but the oral history project began in 2009 by Claudia Bushman. I think it began most by Mormon women in her students in her Mormon women in 20th century course, right? Is where it began. It was sort of a snowball collection. And in 2013, the project donated 150 of these oral histories to the, how do you say it, Honnold Mudd Library here. And this is ongoing. And currently there are 300. There'll be 312 when I get back from Fiji, right? So the second 150 interviews are more diverse than the first 150, just to give you a sense of the collection. The first 150 were mostly in California, Utah, sort of Intermountain West-ish, some in Australia, mostly white women, skewed a little bit older. The second 150 are more diverse, women in Mexico, Kenya, Botswana, South Africa, more diverse groups in the US, such as Navajo, African American, Black women. So that's just to give you a picture of the oral histories and the women who were interviewed for these oral histories. Again, other people are more know a little bit more about that than I do, but these are the things that I have learned. So, okay. Yes, so oral history, I'm also trained as a qualitative researcher. And oral history is both viewed as story and as a methodology into creating knowledge qualitatively. And my focus of my inquiry looking into the oral histories were two research questions, or two focuses of my inquiry. One, I wanted to think about how LDS women talked about personal revelation in their lived experiences in terms of exercising sovereignty. And then I was really keenly interested in how they talked about experiences of, or sort of factors that led to the relinquishment of their sovereignty. And I have I have placed handouts on the edges of the rows. So I would encourage you to pass those out. I put them most over here. So people on this side of the room are responsible for passing those out. And one thing that I discovered as I was trying to put this presentation together, that representing the oral histories, grabbing snippets just was impossible. The richness of these oral histories felt overwhelming to me. And so I thought what I would do is put some on paper and hand it out. This is maybe atypical, but it also gives you something to read if I get boring. So that's good. These oral histories that you're seeing answer the second question. Well, they don't answer it, they speak to it. They're examples of how eldest women in oral histories talked about factors that led to the relinquishing of their sovereignty. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted everybody to have it. First, I'm gonna talk about the first personal revelation of sovereignty. So there are several themes that emerged when looking, and one was personal revelation was used to maintain sovereignty in conflicts with priesthood advice. So for many women, personal revelation served as a counterbalance when local leaders issued directives that felt misaligned with their specific needs or inspirations. So they talked about doing, rebellious things such as refusing to cancel a program, or declining a calling, or choosing divorce against counsel. So here's an example. This woman says, on the Monday before, I got a call from the stake president. We chatted for a minute, and then he said, "Sister, I wonder if I would ask you not to do this retreat. Would you do that?" So this was a Relief Society president who refused her stake president's request to counsel a long-time retreat. She said, at this point, this sister says, "I'm thinking you wouldn't dare do that." I said to him, "Well, my answer to that is no, I would not call it off. We are leaving on Friday. We sisters have planned for a year. The date has been on the calendar for months and the bishop has approved it. I think it's really important." So he replied, "So the answer is no, you would not cancel it." I was terribly nervous, but I explained that when I was set apart to be a Relief Society president, I was given a blessing. In that blessing, I was told that I would receive inspiration for our ward sisters and for those women who were around me. I felt that this retreat was inspiration to me because of a need our sisters felt. So my answer was no, I would not cancel it this year. But if you wanted to talk to me about canceling it next year, then we would not plan it. But we were planning the retreat that year and we were going on the retreat. He said, "Oh, I see." So to his credit, he did not cancel us. At that point, my heart was beating out of my chest and I wondered if I would be released or excommunicated. But I was determined to stand up for my sisters. It's funny that this turned out to be the last complaint I ever heard about a retreat. That was some 20 years ago, and our board Relief Society is still doing and have no retreat. So what I found illuminating in this, are you kidding me?
So fast.
So fast. Well, that's why I have them printed out. But what I find illuminating in this is that it's a real lived experience. We can see the tensions that this woman feels. Like she's probably afraid. But the personal revelation is what was the tool. Her connection with personal revelation was the tool that ended up helping her remain sovereign in her. So other areas, there's again, so many. Revelation over local leadership, navigating social policy, that was often around fertility, birth control, working outside the home, education over marriage, priesthood and temple bans, grappling with those things where policy didn't seem to meet doctrine in their minds and how they navigated that. I'll finish with a quote from Self-Interpreted Authorization. She said, I've had favorite general authorities. So women frequently noted that while the gospel is true, leaders are fallible and their interpretations can be flawed. This woman says, I have had favorite general authorities and leaders during different phases in my life. It seems that what I personally needed was usually in place when I needed it. Various bishops have sometimes advised me in ways that I could not accept, but the gospel is true even if human interpretations aren't always right on. And I think this connection to personal revelation is what allowed women to stand in their sovereignty as LDS women in these institutions, in these contexts. And there's another great quote about women standing up with their anti-ERA pamphlets, which I think Caroline had in her slides too. Anyway, the architecture of relinquishing sovereignty focused around the institutional structural obstacles. You see this in your handout. Now I'm really glad I printed that out for you. Disappearing into family life and marriage, outsourcing personal revelation, which I think is a really interesting one. Why do we do that? How do we do that? I mean, what are the pressures and messages? Internally organized conformity and reclaiming sovereignty. It ends on a happy note. So anyway, thank you for allowing me to be here. We'll probably talk more again. Thanks. We have to turn this off now. It's like, you can move on. It's like a tactic from the back. So you can't sneeze or take it off.
Oh, okay. Okay, oh, one here. Okay, are we working here? Is this okay? So, good morning. And I love all the stories in these different examples. And I'm also very aware that our time this morning is very brief. So last summer, Kline and I had the privilege of traveling to Finland to conduct oral histories with Mormon women there, facilitated by Beata Tuominen, who acted as our guide and translator and introduced us to the church women in her life. And that was such a privilege. So we were able to complete about 25 oral history interviews with Finnish Mormon women, nearly all of them conducted in English, and most of the women we talked with were very fluent in English. Though some of our participants had a first language of Finnish, and a minority of them also had a first language of Swedish, as the country has 2 official languages. The youngest women that we interviewed were in their 20s, and the oldest about 80. They lived in and around the 3 largest cities in Finland, Helsinki, Turku, and Tampere, and nearly all of the interviewees were ethnic Finns who were puzzled by our demographic questionnaire that asked about race, as conversations about race and racial categorizations were not part of their experience in Finland. And so their experiences in Mormonism are both similar to and Mormon women in other places. So Finland is often cited as one of the most gender egalitarian countries in the world, and this was part of the sell to go to Finland as a really interesting and really challenging case study for what Mormon women's experiences globally look like. And so in thinking about the structure of Finnish law, social policy, parental leave, affordable high-quality childcare, a single-payer healthcare system, affordable higher education, and the ways in which the social safety net was set up, Finland prioritized gender equality. And this was not a new project for Finland, which had long held the value of gender equality and then enshrined it into law when it gained independence from Russia in 1917. And so for more than a century, Finland has understood itself as a small country of about 5 million people that could not afford to ignore the education and career training of about half its population and still hope to succeed as a country. And so today, there are roughly 5,000
LDS Finns in this predominantly Lutheran country. And the degree to which Finns prioritize gender equality is hard to overstate, and it is the starting point for understanding Mormon women's experience in the church. And so Finnish gender egalitarianism is the lens through which Finnish Mormon women understand their religion. And this was so striking to us throughout this experience. And continually, just caused all kinds of self-reflection and reevaluation. As Finns had a different imagination for gender within the LDS Church. And so these ideas empowered nearly all of our participants to understand American church leaders' comments about separate gendered spheres and the patriarchal system of the church as cultural teachings rooted in American values that didn't really apply to them as Finns. And the strength with which they articulated these ideas was, this was consistent throughout really all of our interviews. And so I'm just going to give you some snippets of what women are related to us. So a middle-aged woman attributed her strength to the fact that Finnish women took over all of the men's chores during the war, and I think that means during World War II, creating a legacy of toughness for Finnish women. Finnish women were very proud of toughness. A younger woman, perhaps 30, viewed the church's strict gender roles as artificial and crafted compared to the natural diversity she sees in Finnish society. Another middle-aged woman articulated that her independence is a 1,000-year-old Finnish trait that sometimes makes traditional marriage challenging. And an older woman in her 70s articulated that she challenged her when she was young and served a mission in Sweden. Her American missionaries, sisters, had very different ideas of modesty, and that when she threw off all of her clothes and walked off into the shower, that was normal and not at all sexual. And so there were just a lot of different ideas that came with gender and bodies and sexuality that Finnish Mormon women emphatically viewed as normal and appropriate within their Mormon community. An older woman, the oldest woman that we interviewed, felt that her Finnish heritage, particularly the history of powerful vicars' wives in Finland, gave her a model for leadership that bypassed modern church constraints. And so many Finnish women rejected, so that is like the starting point for Mormon women in Finland. We were particularly interested in ideas about work, both labor in the home and labor in the workplace. And many Finnish women rejected the idea that the idea of career and their roles as Mormon women were in some kind of conflict. And they often viewed their professional success as part of their spiritual mission. And the structures of Finnish society did not force this choice of motherhood or career that maybe many in America and other places experience, but rather overwhelmingly most of the women we spoke to chose and actively described themselves as choosing both. So one middle-aged woman received a specific blessing, stating that God wanted her to work because she needed to be developing skills to build Zion. Another middle-aged woman served as a CEO in a male-dominated field, viewing her ambition as a personal trait that did not conflict with her faith. A woman in her 70s had maintained a 40-year career as a freelance translator for the church while simultaneously teaching at the university. Another middle-aged woman managed her own business with the full support of her husband, who valued her independence. Eventually, her husband would work for her and under her as the kind of leader of this business. And different middle-aged women worked consistently from age 16 onward to fund her own religious and educational goals, establishing a lifelong habit of financial independence. And so in thinking about agency with regard to these women's stories, I often think about the different forms of agency that Kelsey Burke describes in her lit review, which Caroline mentioned earlier. I also think about the work of Saba Mahmood and Borat Abishai, who both challenge the idea that religious women's resistance to patriarchal systems is the only way to understand agency. My thinking about agency at the moment comes from my recent book project on garments, which is underpinned by a survey of 4,500 church members and their experiences with garments. And we gained some useful insights into agency that help, I think, frame my thinking on Finnish women and their agency. First and most significant is that individuals within the church perceive their agency differently, depending on whether or not they experience doubt as part of their belief. And so church members, garment wearers who did not experience doubt understood themselves as having a lot of freedom to make individual choices that were an extension of their values and church teaching. And for those who did experience doubt, they understood their agency in very different terms. They understood that they existed within a social system that put pressure on them to make particular choices that they had to navigate, recognizing that there are different benefits and costs to making different choices. And so I think about agency through this lens of how people understand it. Overwhelmingly, the Finnish women that we interviewed were really communicating to us that they did not experience doubt, even as they distrusted church leaders' comments on gender. They understand, and so they kind of articulated a sense that their understanding of, if you will, the mind of God with relation to gender was an expansive one, which their free movement and claiming of a greater agency was spiritually important to them and a priority in their lives, which helps to reconfigure, in my mind, ideas about belief and how people experience appropriate LDS belief or conforming LDS belief in very different ways in the world, and that has a direct interaction with their understanding of their agency within their own lives. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Can everyone make sure your microphones are turned on here and on the lapel? Yeah, there's the switches. And this is not. Oh, no. My job. Okay. Guys, we're so excited to do a little bit of some questions about oral history as a method, about the complications of oral history. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. And Vinna, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Vinna, I cannot see you. So if you ever want to jump in at the end of someone's comments, please feel free. I will ask you if I haven't heard from you though. So no pressure either way. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, let's jump right in. One of the questions as you guys were talking that I wanted to jump on right away was in what ways do your findings and insights challenge or expand the dominant narratives of Mormon women, either within the church or in scholarship? The reason I wanted to start out with that was because Erika, you had some really interesting things that you didn't get to say. And so would you like to use this question to, jump into some of that, like the insights that challenge or expand dominant narratives?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I guess I'm not really clear on what dominant narratives are from my data. To be totally honest, I feel like,
I think that's a great question.
yeah, like what do we mean by not dominant narrative, given the diversity of the oral histories of Mormon and globally? I think we make some assumptions about some dominant narratives, and then there clearly are some dominant narratives. So I don't want to speak generally that way. I think that some of the things that the women said that I read, now this is a preliminary analysis, right? So I'm just like looking through them with one guiding focus of inquiry about how personal revelation helps or how we relinquish our agency. One thing that I'm personally really interested in, is this idea of how we experience LDS women giving up or advocating, or the architecture of relinquishment is what I called it, you know. Because I think that we do make assumptions, or assumptions are made, I don't know who's making them, but um, about sovereignty. Like what, in what spaces and in what contexts are women exercising agency, and how much power do they really have? In these, I guess personally. I think some of the findings that I had were pretty in line with some of the dominant ideas that LDS women use personal revelation to say, look, I got personal revelation and I don't have to do that to bench, or that I don't have to take that calling. I think is not, I think we know that, right? I think that is a useful tool for women. I don't know.
I think that's fascinating, just this idea that like a revelation is used as a tool for sovereignty and
Yeah.
for
But it's in line with with the LDS doctrine, right?
And
That's where the conflicts kind of, where the tensions are. It's like, this is LDS doctrine, and yet, when we say that, this woman is palpably fearful, she's gonna be excommunicated because she's going up against, the idea of a state president. So I think that shows us in a real way how this woman exercised sovereignty in a very common experience within the church. So I think that's what's so fascinating to me about the oral histories, is that there's diversity in voice, and we can see how women are exercising sovereignty, or using, in this case, personal revelation. I think it's similar for the architecture of relinquishment, right? Sort of this disappearing into marriage, or outsourcing spirituality, which is, again, against the doctrine. So I think those tensions come up a lot in the histories that I read.
Thank you. Vinna, can you speak to, just going off of what, your own experience doing oral histories, what can you say about like challenging or expanding any dominant narratives that you are aware of?
Yeah, I really appreciated both the speakers, and talking about sovereignty, and then also with Nancy talking about the women in Finland. Um, to me, it's fascinating when I'm interviewing global women, whether in Indian diaspora or some African women, their voices are still being seen as an outlier. And I think the even the idea of this woman who was afraid of the stake president, that's not something you see when you talk to global Latter-day Saint women. Um, Not that I don't think it happens, but I think it's just there's not a lot of it in terms of fear. And I think that comes with the cultural impact of the church in United States. And it's still talking about a very specific community, which is um, Caucasian American, and oftentimes middle class women. And so I think that's been one of the challenges when we're talking about Latter-day Saint women in an agency, because we um sometimes it's also been frustrating to me as an oral historian to not to make the case that these are not outliers, that we have more members outside of the United States, and yet there's still a dominant narrative when it comes to women. I remember the example of when Sister Johnson had had made that post about that she had worked her whole life, and how many women in the US were really angry, and I think those anger need to be heard and acknowledged, and the pain. But when I talked to women outside, first of all, they were all surprised. They were like, well, we've always had to work. There was never a question. There's no way you can make it as a family with only one single income. It's impossible. And that doesn't work in many of these different societies. So I think these conversation, this is where I do think that showcasing the global voices of women outside can also uplift women in the US and also help them understand, it is possible and you're not alone. And also um have it's I don't want it I don't want it to be just like an outlier story, because it's not. More and more of these women that I interview, we hear very similar experiences. And that's also why I appreciated Nancy's insights, because even the women that Hazel O'Brien interviewed in Ireland, who are Latter-day Saint, had talked about that, where they viewed gender, they viewed marriage, they viewed education very differently. And these are Caucasian women. And so there's a conversation that we also need to have is, well, who is driving the dominant narrative when it comes to global Latter-day Saint women?
Vinna, that's so insightful. Thank you. And actually, Nancy, can you pick up with that?
Yeah.
I bet you have a lot to say.
Yeah, thank you both for your comments, but, picking up on what you're saying, Dina, what we heard throughout interviews in Finland was the sense that, that Mormon women of many different ages and stages were articulating feedback, that they were giving their priesthood leaders feedback, and there was a strong cultural expectation within a cultural milieu of like gender equality, that it was priesthood leaders' responsibility to hear and use that feedback. And so there was a strong, instead of being, a lot of women were referenced giving priesthood leaders feedback when they were doing things that they had worked on, and that seemed to be an ongoing and expected part of like the relationship between church members and male leaders on the ground in congregations, is that there was just going to always be this like back and forth with feedback. And that was a different framing than maybe I have heard in my cultural context in St. George, but is maybe just a different dynamic. And I think an important one to hear.
Right. Thank you. Those were very, very helpful. Okay, I have one more question and then we're gonna open it up to the audience for some Q&A as well. The other question I wanted to kind of feel out with all of you is, what are the ethical or interpretive challenges you must address in telling these women's stories? Vinna, do you want to go ahead and start us out with that? You can cover anything from, interview questions, power dynamics, interview process. Just go ahead, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, I I don't think there's a great author. She looks at Muslim women in America, Haddad, and she talks about how there's there's no such thing as neutral scholarship. And I think this is something that we need to just say it out loud, whether we're inside or outside or in between, whatever it is, we have many different positionalities. And I so appreciate scholars who are just upfront about it when they are doing their research and their work. because I do think all these different angles of how they are looking at the research, the questions, especially on women and agency, are always going to be rich and it will bring something. It will add to the conversation. And so and as an insider, because I'm an active Latter-day Saint, but I'm also, there's many times where I do not feel as an insider. And there's many times where I'm like, I don't get this. This is so weird for me. I feel like an alien right now. Um, and I think there's many other women who also feel that way. And so I think that's one thing that it's important for scholars to acknowledge that we do have a positionality. And in terms of ethical issues, one of the things that it's been hard for me because Mauritius is very small, and you'll see this when you're doing global oral history, is we don't have a lot of members outside of the US in many places. And so we have to be very careful with our identifying markers. Very careful because oftentimes many of these women are vulnerable and they are trusting us and they want to speak and they want to share. And sometimes there's going to be things that they will share that will trigger trauma. So we have to be very careful uh, when we are sharing their stories and also giving them many many times spaces and time to reflect on the interview. And I do that a few times. Even for this presentation, I went back and reached out to the woman and said, look, this is what I'm presenting. This is what I'm writing. I know you signed a consent form, but would you want to add? Would you want to delete? Would whatever you want to do? And she did. She modified some of those things. And so I think constantly having this reciprocity also shows that we are understanding that we're taking this seriously.
Thank you, Vinna. Thank you. Erika, as you're jumping into the Claremont collections and interpreting, and getting ready to do your own interviews, how are you approaching this question of ethical and interpretation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought a lot about that actually. So just with my trip to Fiji, I think, you think about interviewing and so I'll be working with a Fijian woman and is actually going to be doing most of the interviews. She is LDS. She was my graduate student. And she's back. I'm doing, we have this ongoing collaboration. So I trust her. We know each other, and I have more, say, expertise in qualitative research, but she has the cultural knowledge and insider as a Fijian LDS woman to be these interviews. And I think that's important as much as possible. I think he was talking about that too as an insider. Our positionalities really matter. I know that whatever comes out of an interview is co-constructed, right? So who the two people are matters in terms of what is able to be said, what isn't said. And so when you go to interpret it, you really have to consider that carefully. And I think understanding, from my perspective, understanding a woman's story in the context of her life, I think generalizability is something, and usefulness is something that we talk about. And I think that we just kind of have to think about it differently. We're looking for resonance. We want to have stories that all these women can, I think, resonate with in terms of at least my question about sovereignty. Like, what does it look like? Right. That's sort of what I want at the end of the day. That what one woman's story needs to be interpreted within the context of her life, her circumstances, sociocultural, SES, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not totally sure how to do that. But I think it's important to have insider in multiple positionalities when you're doing that work.
Yeah.
Things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, Nancy, do you have any additional comments on that?
I mean, I think the flavor of my comments is very similar to what has already been said. I'm always thinking about these, like wanting to hear and honor and acknowledge what women are saying about their lives, and also understand the system that they exist within, right? And even if women in Finland were not like articulating fear about pushing back on their leaders, it doesn't mean that there are also not like limits to their agency within a particular system. And so it's like, how do we honor these stories? Because the stories and the telling and sharing of stories is really quite sacred. You know, if you do oral history, it is a gift to receive somebody's story and all of its complexity with both whatever they shared and chose not to share, right? Like that's something we really have to honor. And also to find ways to engage critically with maybe the themes or topics that they're communicating about that can help us, you know, make meaning and dig deeper. And so I'm always, I think, you know, these are tensions we wanting to honor, but also wanting to think about, okay, well, how is that true within that system, or what else is being communicated, you know, and I think that's challenging.
Yes. Thank you, thank you. Okay, we've got about 10-ish minutes. That means we can take maybe 2, maybe 3 questions. I already see a hand, so yeah, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is my alma mater, so of course I have questions. In your examination of the different oral history stories, what was a more common experience? Claiming agency, sovereignty, or relinquishing it?
Is that to me?
Anyway.
Okay, let me repeat that question really fast. Okay, we're talking, claiming, sorry,
Yeah, what's the more common experience?
what's the more
Women
common
claiming
experience?
Sovereignty and agency or relinquishing it? And that's how it is in oral history.
Excellent. Okay, so is it more common for women to reclaim sovereignty or to relinquish it? In the process of doing these oral histories? And yeah.
Yeah, no, and I would say that women really perceive this differently according to their like belief orientation. And so I would say that overwhelmingly we spoke to women who were not communicating doubt. And so with women who felt like they were all in with the church in Finland. And so I think they saw, and as I understand it, then that orientation to belief generally comes with a strong sense of, I have power to make a lot of choices in my life, or at least that is the self-perception of agency. And so that's what we heard. And again, I'm not gonna say that our sampling is like a generalizable sample according to all people who ever participated in the church in Finland. But according to the women we spoke to, I think they felt like they absolutely communicated a lot of agency and ability to make a lot of different kinds of choices in their lives. Yeah, and we saw they communicated relatively few like limits to that agency, though there were a few times when limits came.
So interesting. Thank you. Yeah, Erika, do you want to add something to that?
I mean, my response was maybe, oh, I can't answer that question. That's too complicated in nuance, because similarly, I feel like it depended, like I was saying kind of before, in the context of who the person is. It's just, that's a binary that's really hard. Because what I found in the stories that I read, and it's preliminary, right? I didn't do it exhaustive. I didn't read all 300. Is that they coexisted quite a bit. There were moments of exercising sovereignty and moments of really quickly relinquishing, lots of grappling. And so it's hard to, and I think that's kind of real. Like there are times where there's grappling and there's relinquishing, and I think that having lots of examples of what that looks like can help maybe move the needle more towards empowerment, towards, okay, this is normalizing it, and then also this is what it looks like in, like I said, looking for resonance. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Vinna, if you want to speak to that too, I can imagine there's some interesting global perspectives about what it even means to relinquish agency versus, yeah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think for my work, what I've seen a more complex picture of how agency is continually negotiated, it's spoken, it's revised, sometimes it's very quietly reimagined in the everyday practices of these women, of how they see it. Many of them, they don't see it as a private autonomy. because you don't exist in vacuum. And so there's a lot of factors in terms of coloniality and gender and class. And so so many of the women that I talked about, I interviewed, they come from very strict and strong patriarchal structures. And for them, the church, the way they see the gospel has been more liberation in terms of being able to speak up, having more church callings, and being in leadership positions. Many of them come from a Christian Catholic background. And so that was something for them that was new to just have leadership, more leadership position. And then the idea of with Indians, and I grew up in an Indian family, and I've seen this. It's strongly not just patriarchal, it's not nuclear, it's a lot connected with extended families. So many of these women would talk about, well, it says husband and wife should help each other. And here you have fifth, sixth generation of Indians who this is something new for them. And so that also, and it did cause tension among extended family members because that's a theology that they're not familiar with.
That is fascinating, Vinna. I love that word you use, reimagined. So interesting. Thank you for the question. I saw a hand over here. Yes, do you want to?
So in part, she just answered my question, because my question was that when we speak about this women, do we take into account like their role within the family? And also in regards to the, when you live in a very like matriarchal family or community, how does that affect how they view agency? And also like the role that the male, if there is in the family, how does that affect the way they view agency, right? Because sometimes we question it because we assume there is some agency, but I don't know if all this was taken into account, and like for some women, is that even, like, what are you talking about? If this is how it's done, right?
Right. Okay, I love this, especially within a Latter-day Saint context, where
Yes.
family is sort of central to a lot of things. Okay, so just to repeat the question, we're asking about how these oral histories are sort of interpreted or seen within the context of like family relationships. And looking at, you said like men and how they see men's roles. And also there was one about
Women, like
Women.
the role that she plays in the family, for
And-
example, like when she's the head of the household, single women. This,
and how women interpret their own roles in the family, whether single, head of household, man, whatever that might look like. So let's start with Erika. Do you have anything to add to that? You're looking. Do you want me to go to Nancy?
Well, I mean, I was just trying to, and what's all over the place, but I think, I hope I'm gonna speak to your question, but what I saw in a lot of, oral histories was, women, what I was talking about their role in the family, some of the women talked about, I think there's a bunch of quotes about disappearing into family and marriage, right? And I also read a lot of women who exercise sovereignty by choosing motherhood and embracing this role and of being a mom, of being, stay at home. And these are mostly the white women in the first 150. So that's the social context of the oral histories that I was reading. So I mostly just want to say that it's important that we take into account the role, the intersectionalities of the women when we are interpreting these. I think your question confirms the point of the importance of really noticing the intersectionality of the women, the role in the family, the sociocultural context in which they live, right? In order to make interpretations about whether it's agency, whether they meet their sovereignty, or are they exercising sovereignty or not, right? Like, I think that all these are aspects of their lives. I don't even want to call them constraints, but aspects of their lives that are so important in the interpretation of an idea such as agency or sovereignty, right? So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, like starting a family within the context of middle class America is different
Yeah.
than in other places in the world. Thank you. Yeah, yes, there's something to say.
In the context of Finland, we did not hear a lot of women talking about themselves as losing themselves in marriage because they had strong identities and roles also outside of the home generally. And so we often had younger women who had the example of their mother also having a career, often as a substantive career. And so I'm not sure that they would describe themselves as matriarchal, but there were certainly a lot of women doing a lot of different kinds of work in their lives, and that offered a strong example of, and a lot of imagination for imagining a possibility. And so, and we also heard about like husbands and wives, sometimes when the children were young, fathers can also take paternity leave. And so sometimes depending on which spouse had the better paying job at the moment, you know, kind of trading off with childcare and it not being motherhood as a gendered role that we meant you had to stay home, you know, stay home for and relinquish career. But rather there was a lot more give and take. There was a lot of description in our interviews of both men and women doing cooking and cleaning and childcare. And so that was you know, perhaps different or similar to other contexts, but that seemed to be a norm.
Yeah, oh, thank you, that's wonderful, and Vinna, you have the last word on this. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think for Asian, I'm just thinking about Asian in terms of Asian and Asian diaspora, South Asian. Education is really big. And it's, you're taught at a very young age, you need to get your degree. You need to have at least your bachelor degree, and you need to work, and you need to be able to sustain yourself. And so for many of the women that I talked to, there was no question about not just going to school and getting a degree, but also working. And for many of these women in Mauritius and some of the women that I interviewed in Africa also, staying home mom is a privilege in the global South. Many women will tell you that is just, it's not feasible. And so for them, just the idea of staying home is something that they will. I had one woman in Mauritius who's Latter-day Saint said, well, it's always the expats who come and who are Latter-day Saints, the other one who are stay-home mom. And so that all already tells you quite a bit of how it's viewed as something, a luxury. It's a privilege to be able to do that. So there's two things. It's that they value education, not just to have a degree, but to do something with it. And so women will say, well, I even if they stay home for a few years, or they would work part-time, or they'll have talking about extended family, you'll have a lot of grandmas and aunts who would help take care of the children. And so they're able to pursue and work. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that closes us right out. If you have any interest in checking out the Claremont Mormon Oral History collections, you can find them on the website that was shared earlier.
Yes, and there's gonna be an oral history table.
Yes.
We're gonna have a half-hour break right here. And so feel free to learn more about oral histories, maybe how to conduct them if you ever want to be interviewed. We'd love to tell you more. And also, right down the hall is our incredible art exhibition. So just go straight out that way. 2 rooms off to the side, you will find some amazing art by Mormon women. So I'll be in half an hour.